The heir to the Russian throne was 8 years old and dying. For days, he'd been screaming in agony as internal bleeding filled his abdomen. His legs were paralyzed. The doctors stood around uselessly because there was nothing they could do. The empress sent a desperate telegram to a peasant mystic hundreds of miles away. Then, impossibly, the bleeding stopped. This wasn't a miracle, but genetics. The boy had hemophilia, passed down from his great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. 9 of her descendants would die from this disease. Countless others carried the gene in silence, passing it to their children without knowing. And the political consequences reached far beyond medicine, contributing to revolution in Russia, instability in Spain, and succession crises across the continent. Let's start with where it all began, with a 5-foot-tall queen who had no idea she was carrying a genetic time bomb. Queen Victoria was born on May 24, 1819, at Kensington Palace in London. She wasn't supposed to be queen. Her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, was the 4th son of King George III, and he died when Victoria was just 8 months old. But through a series of deaths and succession complications, Victoria found herself heir to the British throne. She became queen in 1837 at age 18. In 1840, she married her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. This wasn't unusual for royalty. Marrying cousins was standard practice for consolidating power and keeping wealth in the family. What was unusual was how prolific Victoria and Albert would be. Between 1840 and 1857, Victoria gave birth to 9 children, 4 sons and 5 daughters. Victoria, Princess Royal, born 1840, would marry into the German royal family and become German empress. Edward, born 1841, would become King Edward VII. Alice, born 1843, would marry into the German nobility and carry hemophilia to the Prussian royal family and to Russia. Alfred, born 1844, would become Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Helena, born 1846, possibly a carrier but unclear. Louise, born 1848, no children, so hemophilia status unknown. Arthur, born 1850, not a hemophiliac. Leopold, born 1853, the first diagnosed hemophiliac in the British royal family. Beatrice, born 1857, a carrier who would pass hemophilia to the Spanish royal family. For the first several years, everything seemed normal. Victoria had healthy children. Albert was a devoted husband and father. The royal family appeared to be thriving. And then, on April 7, 1853, Victoria gave birth to her 8th child, a son named Leopold. Please forgive me if I mispronounce some of these names. From the very beginning, Leopold was different. He was described as a delicate child, constantly bruising, constantly in pain. As he grew older, the problems became more obvious. He would fall while playing and develop massive bruises that lasted for weeks. His joints would swell and lock up, rendering him unable to walk. Sometimes he bled for no apparent reason at all, blood seeping into his muscles and joints, causing excruciating pain. The doctors were baffled. In 1858 or 1859, when Leopold was about 5 or 6 years old, they finally diagnosed him with hemophilia. The disease had been described in medical literature, but it was rare, poorly understood, and completely untreatable. Victoria was devastated. She had no idea where this disease had come from. Neither her family nor Albert's family had any history of hemophilia. There was no one to blame, no explanation for why her beautiful son was suffering. What Victoria didn't know, what no one could have known in 1858, was that she herself was the source. Hemophilia is caused by a mutation on the X chromosome. Women have 2 X chromosomes, so if one carries the mutation, the other can compensate, making them carriers without symptoms. Men have 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome, so if their single X chromosome carries the mutation, they have the disease. They have no backup. Victoria had been born with a spontaneous mutation. Scientists believe it likely occurred in the sperm of her father, Edward, Duke of Kent, who was 51 years old when Victoria was conceived. Advanced paternal age is known to increase the rate of genetic mutations. That single mutation, a tiny error in Victoria's DNA, would go on to kill her descendants for 3 generations. But in 1853, genetics hadn't been discovered yet. The work of Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, wouldn't be published until the 1860s and wouldn't be widely recognized until the 1900s. Victoria and her doctors had no framework for understanding heredity, no way to predict which of her other children might be affected. They could only watch Leopold suffer and try to keep him alive. Leopold's childhood was isolated and restricted. Victoria, terrified that he would injure himself and bleed to death, forbade him from playing with his siblings. He couldn't run, couldn't ride horses, couldn't do any of the normal activities expected of a prince. He spent much of his time indoors, reading, studying, developing his intellect because his body couldn't be developed. He was brilliant, inheriting his father's artistic sensibilities and intellectual curiosity. But he was also lonely, frustrated, desperate for independence from his overprotective mother. The restrictions placed on Leopold were suffocating. While his brothers went to military academies and learned to hunt and ride, Leopold was confined to quiet pursuits. He couldn't join the army or navy, the traditional career paths for younger sons of the monarch. He couldn't even engage in the vigorous sports that Victorian gentlemen were expected to enjoy. His life was defined by what he couldn't do rather than what he could do. But Leopold was intellectually gifted. He studied music, art, and literature. He became fluent in several languages. He developed a deep appreciation for culture and education that would shape his later work as a royal patron. In many ways, his physical limitations pushed him toward intellectual pursuits that might have been neglected if he'd been able to pursue a military career like his brothers. Leopold managed to convince Victoria to let him attend Christ Church, Oxford University, from 1872 to 1876. This was a rare victory. At Oxford, he thrived intellectually, making friends, attending lectures, living something resembling a normal life. He became close with Alice Little, the real-life inspiration for Alice in Wonderland, though whether they had a romantic relationship is debated. He was also close with her sister Edith, and when Edith died suddenly shortly after becoming engaged to one of Leopold's friends, Leopold served as a pallbearer at her funeral. What's clear is that Leopold craved normalcy, craved freedom from the constant supervision and restrictions his disease imposed. During his Oxford years, Leopold also became heavily involved in Freemasonry. He was initiated into the Apollo University Lodge while at Christ Church, proposed for membership by his older brother, the Prince of Wales, who was serving as worshipful master at the time. Leopold took his Masonic duties seriously and eventually served as master of the lodge himself from 1876 to 1877. Later, he became provincial Grand Master for Oxfordshire, a position he held until his death. In 1882, he laid the foundation stone of the Masonic Hall on Marlborough Street in Banbury, one of his last public ceremonial acts. In 1881, Victoria created Leopold the Duke of Albany. In 1882, he married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont. Finding a wife had been difficult. Many families were reluctant to marry their daughters to a hemophiliac prince. The risks were obvious. Leopold might die young, leaving her a widow. Any sons they had together would have a 50% chance of having hemophilia. But Helena accepted him, and by all accounts, they were genuinely fond of each other. The courtship and marriage negotiations were complicated by Leopold's dual afflictions. Beyond hemophilia, Leopold also suffered from mild epilepsy, though this condition was less well understood and less openly discussed. In the eyes of many contemporaries, including her mother, epilepsy was actually considered more socially stigmatizing than hemophilia. The seizures Leopold occasionally experienced added another layer of complexity to his search for a bride and to concerns about his ability to fulfill royal duties. In 1883, Helena gave birth to a daughter, Princess Alice. Leopold now had a child, an heir, a family of his own. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might actually have a future. He took on more royal duties, representing the Queen at various ceremonies and events. He became involved in charitable work and patronized educational institutions. He seemed to be building a meaningful life despite his physical limitations. But hemophilia is unforgiving. In early 1884, Leopold's doctors recommended he spend the winter in Cannes, France to escape the harsh English weather. Cold weather exacerbated his joint pain, a common symptom of hemophilia, where blood seeps into the joints, causing inflammation and damage. Helena, pregnant with their second child, stayed in England. On March 28, 1884, Leopold slipped and fell on a staircase at Villaneva, the private residence where he was staying in Cannes. He injured his knee and hit his head. For anyone else, it would have been a minor accident, the sort of fall that might result in a bruise or temporary soreness. For Leopold, it was fatal. Blood pooled in his brain, causing a cerebral hemorrhage. He died in the early morning hours of March 28, 1884. He was 30 years old, just beginning to establish himself as an independent adult, just starting to build a family and a legacy. His daughter Alice was barely a year old. She would never remember her father. 4 months later, in July 1884, Helena gave birth to a son, Charles Edward. He was born healthy, unaffected by hemophilia, because sons cannot inherit the X chromosome from their father. But Alice, Leopold's daughter, had inherited her father's X chromosome, the one carrying the hemophilia mutation. She was a carrier, guaranteed to be, because every daughter of a hemophiliac inherits his affected X chromosome. Leopold was the first, but he wouldn't be the last of Victoria's descendants to die from hemophilia, because Victoria had daughters, and those daughters, unlike Leopold, could have children who would spread the disease even further. Let's talk about Princess Alice, Victoria's third child, born in 1843. Alice was known for her compassion and her interest in nursing and social welfare. She married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine, in 1862. The marriage was initially opposed by Victoria, who didn't want to lose another daughter so soon after the Princess Royal had moved to Prussia, but eventually she consented. Alice moved to Darmstadt, where she threw herself into charitable work, particularly improving nursing standards and hospital care in the German states. Alice and Louis had 7 children together. One of those children was a son named Friedrich, born in 1870. Friedrich, called Friddy in the family, seemed healthy at first. But in February 1873, when he was not quite 3 years old, he cut his ear. The bleeding wouldn't stop. For 3 days, blood kept flowing from a minor cut, and the doctors could do nothing. That's when the family realized Friddy had hemophilia, just like his uncle Leopold. 3 months later, in May 1873, Friddy and his older brother Ernst were playing in their mother's bedroom at the Neues Palace, the family's residence in Darmstadt. The brothers were looking out windows in different rooms, trying to see each other. Alice left the room briefly to check on Ernst. In that moment, Friddy climbed onto a chair to get a better view out the window. The chair tipped. He fell from the window to the ground below, approximately 20 feet. Because of his hemophilia, the fall triggered massive internal bleeding. Friddy died from his injuries the same day. He was 2 years and 7 months old. Princess Alice was inconsolable. She had watched her brother Leopold suffer with hemophilia for years, and now her own son had the disease. And now that son was dead from a fall that wouldn't have killed a normal child. Alice wrote to Queen Victoria about the tragedy, describing her anguish in letters that revealed the profound emotional toll of watching a hemophiliac child suffer and die. The death devastated the entire family. Alice fell into a deep depression that lasted months. She threw herself even more intensely into her charitable work, perhaps seeking distraction from her grief. The tragedy also meant that Alice now knew for certain she was a carrier of hemophilia, and that knowledge must have weighed heavily on her as she considered the future of her other children. But Alice had other children. She had 2 more daughters, Irene, born 1866, and Alex, born 1872. Both were carriers of the hemophilia gene, though no one knew it yet, and both would marry into other royal families, spreading the disease further. In November 1878, Alice's family was struck by another tragedy. Diphtheria swept through the household, affecting Alice, her husband Louis, and several of their children. Alice nursed them all devotedly. Her youngest daughter, Marie, called May, died from the disease on November 16th. Alice herself contracted diphtheria and died on December 14, 1878. She was only 35 years old. She died on the same date that her father, Prince Albert, had died 17 years earlier, a coincidence that deeply affected Queen Victoria. Alice's death meant she never knew the full extent of how her daughters would carry hemophilia forward into the next generation. She never knew that Irene would have two hemophiliac sons. She never knew that Alex would become Empress of Russia and give birth to Alexei, whose hemophilia would contribute to the fall of the Russian monarchy. Alice died believing the hemophilia had claimed only Fridtey. The wider tragedy was still decades away. Princess Irene married her first cousin, Prince Heinrich of Prussia, in 1888. Heinrich was the brother of Kaiser Wilhelm II, making Irene a member of the German imperial family. The marriage was controversial not because of potential hemophilia. At that point, Irene had only healthy children from her sister's families as evidence, but because first cousin marriages were beginning to be viewed with more medical skepticism. Still, royal marriages were about politics and alliances, and the match went forward. Between 1889 and 1904, Irene gave birth to 3 sons. 2 of them had hemophilia. Prince Valdemar, born 1889, and Prince Heinrich, born 1900, both suffered from the bleeding disorder that had killed their uncle Fridtey and great-uncle Leopold. The younger Heinrich died in 1904 at age 4 after falling from a chair. He hit his head, suffered a brain hemorrhage, and died the same way Fridtey had died 31 years earlier. A minor fall, fatal bleeding, a young life ended. The terrible pattern was repeating itself. Valdemar lived longer. He survived childhood, adolescence, even World War I. He married in 1919 and had no children, perhaps recognizing that as a hemophiliac, any daughters would be carriers, and any sons from a carrier wife would risk having the disease. He lived with hemophilia for 56 years, experiencing countless bleeding episodes, joint damage, and chronic pain. Medical care had improved somewhat by the early 20th century, better pain management, better understanding of how to minimize bleeding, but there was still no cure, no treatment that could address the underlying problem. In 1945, at the end of World War II, Valdemar was in Bavaria, recovering from a stomach hemorrhage related to his hemophilia. The Soviet army was advancing from the east. Germany was collapsing. Valdemar and his wife fled to Tutzing, a town south of Munich, to stay with friends. Valdemar needed blood transfusions to survive. His doctor found a donor and gave him 1 transfusion, but Valdemar needed more blood to replace what he'd lost. The doctor searched for another donor, but before he could arrange it, American forces arrived in the area. In the chaos of war's end, all medical resources were diverted to treat victims from the nearby Dachau concentration camp that had just been liberated. The survivors in the camp were in desperate condition, starving, diseased, dying. The American medical personnel naturally prioritized them over other patients. Valdemar's German doctor couldn't get access to the blood his patient desperately needed. On May 2, 1945, just days after Hitler's suicide and days before Germany's surrender, Prince Valdemar of Prussia died from lack of a blood transfusion. He was 56 years old, the last male hemophiliac in the Prussian branch of the family. The circumstances of Valdemar's death are particularly tragic because he was so close to survival. Had the war ended a few weeks earlier or later, if the camp liberation had happened in a different location, if there had just been a bit more blood available, he might have survived. He had lived with hemophilia through 56 years of bleeding episodes and painful recoveries, only to die from lack of medical resources in the final days of World War II. But let's go back to Alice's other daughter, because this is where the story gets even more consequential for world history. Princess Alex of Hesse, Alice's youngest daughter, was born in 1872. She was 6 years old when her mother died. She was raised by her grandmother, Queen Victoria, who took a special interest in her motherless grandchildren. Alex was quiet, serious, deeply religious, with a tendency toward melancholy that would intensify as she grew older. In 1884, when she was 12 years old, she traveled to Russia for the wedding of her sister, Elizabeth, to Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich. At that wedding, Alex met the heir to the Russian throne, Tsaritsevich Nicholas, who would later become Tsar Nicholas II. They fell in love. It took years of negotiation, years of Nicholas pressing his parents to allow the match, but finally, in 1894, they married. The timing was bittersweet. Nicholas's father, Tsar Alexander III, died just weeks before the wedding, meaning Nicholas ascended to the throne as Tsar while still in mourning. Alex converted to Russian Orthodoxy and took the name Alexandra Fyodorovna. She became Empress of Russia at 24 years old, thrust into one of the most demanding roles in the world with little preparation. Between 1895 and 1901, Alexandra gave birth to 4 daughters: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. 4 healthy girls, but no son, no heir. In Russia, the throne could only pass to a male. Nicholas needed a son. The entire empire was waiting for a son. The pressure on Alexandra was immense, almost unbearable. After each daughter's birth, there was disappointment, whispers, criticism. Some suggested Nicholas should divorce Alexandra and remarry to get an heir. The stress affected Alexandra's health and deepened her religious fervor as she prayed desperately for a son. On July 30th, 1904, she finally gave birth to a boy. They named him Alexei Nikolaevich. The celebration across Russia was enormous. Cannons fired salutes in every major city. Church bells rang. There were prayers of thanksgiving in every Orthodox church. Finally, the succession was secure. Nicholas had his heir. The dynasty had a future. But within weeks, the celebration turned to horror. Alexei began bleeding. At 6 weeks old, he had an episode of uncontrollable bleeding from his navel. The doctors examined him carefully and came to a devastating conclusion. Alexei had hemophilia, the heir to the Russian throne, the future Tsar of the largest empire on Earth, had the same disease that had killed Alexandra's uncle Leopold, her nephew Fritzi, her nephew Heinrich, and would go on to kill her nephew Waldemar. Alexandra was shattered. She had known she might be a carrier. She had watched her brother die from hemophilia as a child. She had seen what the disease did to families. But she had hoped, prayed that she had escaped it. 4 healthy daughters had given her false confidence. Now her only son, the child Russia had waited years for, was condemned to a life of pain and an early death. Nicholas and Alexandra made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. They would keep Alexei's hemophilia secret. If the Russian people knew their future czar was so fragile, it would undermine confidence in the monarchy. If Russia's enemies knew the heir was compromised, it might embolden them. So Alexei's condition was classified as a state secret. Even close relatives weren't told for several years. Only the immediate family, a handful of doctors, and a few trusted servants knew the truth. The secrecy created an atmosphere of isolation around the imperial family that would later contribute to their downfall. Alexei's childhood was defined by hemophilia. He couldn't play rough games with other children. He was forbidden from many activities that boys his age normally enjoyed. When he did get injured, which happened frequently despite all precautions, the episodes were agonizing. Blood would seep into his joints, especially his knees and ankles, causing them to swell grotesquely. The joints would lock up, leaving him unable to bend his legs. Sometimes the bleeding was so severe he couldn't walk at all, and sailors assigned to watch him had to carry him everywhere. The imperial yacht was modified with ramps so Alexei could be wheeled around during bad episodes. His tutor, Pierre Gilliard, who was with the family for years, described one attack. The poor child lay in such pain, dark patches under his eyes and his little body all distorted and the leg terribly swollen. Anna Virabova, a lady-in-waiting close to the family, wrote, "It was endless torture for the boy and for each of us. He was screaming from the pain all the time, and we had to close our ears while taking care of him." These descriptions from people who witnessed Alexei's suffering firsthand paint a horrifying picture of what hemophilia meant in practice for a young child with no access to modern treatment. The bleeding episodes could last days or weeks. When blood seeped into Alexei's joints, it destroyed bones and tendons. The blood itself was toxic to the joint tissue, causing inflammation and progressive damage with each episode. The only treatment was massage and careful exercise to prevent the joints from permanently stiffening, but this had to be done carefully because too much manipulation could cause more bleeding. It was a delicate balance between preventing permanent disability and avoiding further injury. In photographs from the period, Alexei is sometimes shown with one foot resting on a box, unable to straighten his knee because the joint had been so damaged by repeated bleeding. In other photos, he's in a wheelchair or being carried. The official portraits tried to hide his condition, showing him in miniature military uniform standing straight, but the candid family photographs reveal the reality: a sick child who spent much of his time unable to walk normally. Alexei himself was acutely aware of his limitations and deeply resented them. He once asked his mother angrily, "Why can other boys have everything and I nothing?" When he saw his older sisters riding horses, an activity he was forbidden to do, he cried with frustration. He wanted desperately to be normal, to play like other children, to not be constantly watched and restricted. The psychological toll of hemophilia on Alexei's emotional development was significant, contributing to periods of depression and outbursts of frustrated anger. There was no medication, no treatment, no cure. Doctors could do nothing except keep him still, apply ice, and wait for the bleeding to stop on its own. Sometimes they made things worse. Early on, doctors gave Alexei aspirin to ease his pain, not knowing that aspirin thins the blood and makes bleeding worse. It was only later, when Rasputin told them to stop the aspirin, that they realized it was exacerbating the problem. This accidental insight may have been one reason Alexandra came to trust Rasputin so completely. He had immediately identified something the trained doctors had missed. Enter Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a peasant from Siberia who had developed a reputation as a mystic and healer. He was introduced to the imperial family in 1905, shortly after Alexei's diagnosis. Alexandra, desperate for anything that might help her son, was willing to try anyone who claimed healing powers, and Rasputin seemed to work. Multiple times, when Alexei was in crisis, when the bleeding seemed unstoppable, Rasputin would arrive or send a telegram, and the bleeding would mysteriously stop. Modern medical historians have proposed several explanations for Rasputin's apparent success. One theory is that Rasputin used hypnosis or calming techniques that reduced Alexei's stress and anxiety, which in turn reduced his blood pressure and helped the bleeding stop naturally. Another theory is that Rasputin's main contribution was telling the doctors to stop bothering Alexei, to stop giving him aspirin, to stop constantly examining and manipulating him, which allowed his body to heal without interference. A third possibility is simply coincidence and timing. Many of Alexei's bleeding episodes would have stopped eventually on their own, and Rasputin just happened to be present or communicate at the right moments. Whatever the mechanism, Alexandra believed absolutely that Rasputin could save her son, and that belief gave Rasputin enormous influence. The most famous incident occurred in the fall of 1912 at Spala, a hunting lodge in Poland. Alexei, then 8 years old, was stepping into a boat when he slipped and badly bruised his upper thigh and groin. The injury triggered massive internal bleeding in his abdomen. For 11 days he suffered in agony. His abdomen swelled grotesquely, his legs became paralyzed. He screamed continuously, crying out, "Lord, have mercy on me," over and over. The doctors prepared drafts of his death announcement. A priest administered last rites, preparing the boy for death. Alexandra, who hadn't slept in days, was in a state of exhausted hysteria. She knelt by Alexei's bed, praying, weeping, refusing to accept that he was dying. Court observers later wrote that she aged visibly during those 11 days, her hair turning grayer, her face becoming gaunt. Her friend, Anna Virabova, sent a telegram to Rasputin, hundreds of miles away in Siberia, begging him to pray for Alexei. Rasputin responded with a telegram that read, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." The next day, inexplicably, the bleeding stopped. Alexei began to recover. The crisis passed. To Alexandra, this was irrefutable proof that Rasputin had intervened with God, that he alone could save her son. From that moment on, nothing could make Alexandra give up the belief that Alexei's welfare, and by extension, the welfare of Russia, depended absolutely upon following Rasputin's advice. This gave Rasputin enormous political power. He wasn't just a faith healer anymore. He was a political advisor, influencing appointments, policies, and even military decisions. He recommended people for ministerial positions. He advised Nicholas on matters of state. He became involved in decisions about Russia's participation in World War I. The Russian nobility hated him. They saw him as a corrupt, manipulative peasant with no business influencing imperial policy. Rumors spread that Rasputin and Alexandra were having an affair, which wasn't true, but the damage to the monarchy's reputation was real. The inability to explain the real reason that Rasputin seemed to be the only person who could help their hemophiliac son meant the imperial family couldn't defend themselves against the growing scandal. In December 1916, a group of nobles led by Prince Felix Yusupov decided to act. They lured Rasputin to Yusupov's palace and murdered him, hoping to free the imperial family from his influence. According to Yusupov's later accounts, they poisoned Rasputin with cyanide-laced cakes and wine, but he didn't die. They shot him multiple times, but he kept moving. Finally, they beat him and threw his body into the Neva River, where he drowned. The details are disputed and possibly exaggerated, but the murder was real. But by then, the damage was done. Russia was losing World War I catastrophically. Food shortages were causing unrest in cities. Workers were striking. The army was demoralized. The public had lost faith in the monarchy. Alexandra's association with Rasputin had become symbolic of everything wrong with the imperial government: out of touch, corrupt, incompetent, mystical rather than rational. In March 1917, revolution erupted. Nicholas II abdicated on March 15th, not only for himself but for Alexei as well. He knew his hemophiliac son could never handle the stress of being czar during a revolution. The family was placed under house arrest, first at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, then moved to increasingly harsh conditions in Tobolsk, Siberia, and finally to Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. During this time in captivity, Alexei's health continued to deteriorate. Without proper medical care, without access to the doctors who had been treating him, his bleeding episodes became more frequent and more severe. In Tobolsk, he suffered another major episode after a fall on stairs, and the family physician Tatiana Botkina wrote in her memoirs, "All of a sudden, Alexei couldn't walk again. He suffered so much from internal bleeding." The hemophilia that had defined his childhood now defined his captivity. On the night of July 17, 1918, Bolshevik revolutionaries under the command of Yakov Yurovsky took the family to a basement room in the Hypatiev house in Ekaterinburg. They told the family they were being moved for safety reasons because anti-Bolshevik forces were approaching the city. Nicholas carried Alexei, who was too weak to walk, down the stairs. The family was told to wait in the basement room. Then the executioners entered and opened fire. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and Alexei, who was 13 years old, too weak to walk, murdered with his family in a basement far from the palaces where he'd been born. Alexei's hemophilia didn't kill him, revolution did. But historians have long argued that hemophilia contributed significantly to the fall of the Russian monarchy. Consider the counterfactual. If Alexei had been healthy, there would have been no need for Rasputin. Without Rasputin, Alexandra's reputation wouldn't have been destroyed. Without the secrecy and the scandals and the perception of a weak heir, the monarchy might have retained more public support. If Nicholas could have abdicated in favor of a healthy son, the monarchy might have survived in some form. If Alexandra hadn't been so desperate to save her son that she was willing to listen to a mystic peasant, the imperial family might have made better political decisions during World War I. We can't know for certain. The Russian Revolution had many causes: the disastrous war, economic problems, food shortages, social unrest that had been building since the failed 1905 revolution, fundamental contradictions in Russian society. The revolution probably would have happened regardless of Alexei's health, but the hemophilia certainly didn't help. It weakened the monarchy at a crucial moment when it needed to project strength and competence. It created a vulnerability that the revolution exploited. And Russia wasn't the only monarchy affected. Let's talk about Spain. Princess Beatrice, Victoria's youngest daughter, born in 1857, was extremely close to her mother. After Albert died in 1861, Victoria was devastated and Beatrice became her constant companion. Beatrice didn't want Beatrice to marry and leave her. For years, Beatrice remained unmarried, living with Victoria, serving as her unofficial secretary and companion. But in 1884, Beatrice fell in love with Prince Henry of Battenberg. Victoria initially opposed the match, unwilling to lose her last unmarried daughter. Eventually, she agreed on the condition that Beatrice and Henry would live with Victoria after marriage. They married in 1885 and had 4 children. 2 of Beatrice's sons, Leopold and Maurice, had hemophilia. Leopold died in 1922 at age 32 during a hip operation, bleeding to death on the operating table. Maurice was killed in action during World War I in 1914 at age 23. Whether Maurice actually had hemophilia is disputed by various sources. Some historians argue it seems unlikely a known hemophiliac would be allowed to serve in combat, suggesting Maurice might have been unaffected or had a very mild case that wasn't obvious. Others point to family records suggesting he did have the condition, but managed to hide it or was determined to serve despite the risks. Beatrice also had a daughter, Princess Victoria Eugenie, called Anna, born in 1887. Anna grew up in England, educated and refined with all the advantages of a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. In 1905, she met King Alfonso XIII of Spain during a state visit. Alfonso fell in love with her. The match seemed perfect politically. It would strengthen ties between Britain and Spain, it would elevate Anna to Queen of Spain, and Alfonso was genuinely infatuated with her. But there was a problem. Anna's brothers Leopold and Maurice both had hemophilia, making it clear that Beatrice was a carrier and that Anna had a 50% chance of being a carrier herself. King Edward VII, Victoria's son and Anna's uncle, warned Alfonso about the risk. The Spanish ambassador to Britain also cautioned Alfonso. Medical experts explained the genetics as they were understood at the time. Alfonso was fully informed of the risk he was taking. He married her anyway. In 1906, Anna converted to Catholicism and married King Alfonso XIII, becoming Queen of Spain. The marriage ceremony itself was marked by tragedy. As the royal couple traveled through Madrid in an open carriage, an anarchist named Mateo Moral threw a bomb hidden in a bouquet of flowers. The bomb killed 24 people and wounded over 100. Alfonso and Anna were splattered with blood, but miraculously unharmed. It was an ominous beginning to their marriage. The real tragedy came the following year. In 1907, Anna gave birth to their first son, Alfonso, the Prince of the Austrias and heir to the Spanish throne. At his circumcision, the doctors discovered he was bleeding uncontrollably. The bleeding wouldn't stop. Horror and realization swept through the palace. Alfonso had hemophilia. The heir to the Spanish throne was compromised from birth. King Alfonso XIII was furious. He had been warned, yes, but warnings are abstract. This was real. His son, his heir, the future of the dynasty, was now vulnerable. Under Spanish law, an heir with a severe physical disability could be barred from inheriting the throne. The entire succession was now uncertain. The king who had ignored the warnings about hemophilia now had to face the consequences. Alfonso blamed Anna. He reportedly told her he would never forgive her for bringing hemophilia into the Spanish royal bloodline. Their marriage, which had started with genuine affection and romance, deteriorated rapidly into resentment and coldness. Alfonso took numerous mistresses, barely concealing his affairs even at court. Anna became isolated, blamed by her husband, vilified by the Spanish public for defiling the pure Spanish royal line with her tainted British blood. The Spanish press, when they learned of the hemophilia, turned viciously against Anna. Cartoons depicted her as a curse on Spain. Articles suggested she had deliberately hidden the risk. Courtiers whispered that the marriage should be annulled. Enna, who had come to Spain excited to be queen, who had converted to Catholicism and embraced Spanish culture, found herself blamed for something she couldn't control. Between 1907 and 1914, Enna and Alfonso had 7 children, 4 sons and 3 daughters. Their second son, Jaime, was born deaf and was excluded from succession because of his disability, adding to the dynasty's problems. Their third child was a daughter, Beatrice. Their fourth child was a son, Juan, born in 1913, who was healthy and unaffected by hemophilia. Finally, a viable heir. But then, in 1914, Enna gave birth to another son, Gonzalo, who also had hemophilia. Both Alfonso and Gonzalo, the hemophiliac princes, wore special padded clothing designed to protect them from bumps and falls that might trigger bleeding episodes. The suits were custom-made, stuffed with cotton and other padding, covering their arms, legs, and torso. They looked bulky and uncomfortable, and they marked the boys as different, as fragile, as compromised. They lived restricted lives, constantly supervised, unable to engage in normal activities for boys of their age and station. The psychological toll was immense. Alfonso, as the heir, felt the weight of expectations he could never meet. He knew he was seen as defective, unsuitable. Gonzalo, the younger son, saw his older brother's struggles and knew the same fate awaited him. Both boys grew up in a household where their disease had destroyed their parents' marriage, where they were simultaneously pitied and blamed for the dynasty's problems. In 1931, political upheaval forced the Spanish royal family into exile. Spain had been struggling with political instability for years: military defeats, economic problems, regional separatist movements, assassination attempts. The monarchy had been weakened by decades of mismanagement and by the perception that the royal family was cursed or tainted. When municipal elections in 1931 showed massive support for Republican candidates, Alfonso XIII chose to go into exile rather than risk civil war. The monarchy was abolished and replaced with the Second Spanish Republic. Alfonso and Enna separated once in exile, never divorcing but living apart for the rest of their lives. Enna returned to England, taking up residence in London to be near her family. Alfonso stayed in various places in Europe, his health declining, his political relevance fading. The hemophilia that had poisoned their marriage had also contributed to the fall of the Spanish monarchy. In 1933, Alfonso, the hemophiliac prince of Asturias, then 26 years old, made a desperate bid for independence and normalcy. He renounced his claim to the defunct Spanish throne so he could marry Edelmira Sampedro, a Cuban commoner he had met at a hospital in Switzerland where he was being treated for his hemophilia. The marriage was controversial and brief. They divorced, and Alfonso married another woman, Martha Roquefort, but that marriage also ended in divorce. He had no children with either wife, likely due to the physical toll hemophilia had taken on his body. On September 6, 1938, Alfonso was in Miami, Florida. He was living in exile far from Spain, his health declining, his royal status meaning nothing in a country that cared little for European nobility. He was being driven by his friend Mildred Gaydon through Miami when Gaydon swerved sharply to avoid an oncoming truck. The car crashed into a telephone booth. Mildred was blinded by shattered glass from the lights. Alfonso's injuries seemed minor at first, just some bumps and bruises, nothing serious. But because of his hemophilia, those minor injuries triggered fatal internal bleeding. He died later that day at age 31, far from Spain, unable to ever reclaim the throne his disease had cost him, dying from injuries that wouldn't have killed anyone else. His younger brother Gonzalo had already died 4 years earlier, and his death was remarkably similar. In August 1934, Gonzalo, then 19, was vacationing with his family at a villa near Portschack, Austria. On August 11th, Gonzalo and his sister Beatrice were driving from Klagenfurt back to their villa. Near Krumpendorf, Beatrice, who was driving, had to swerve sharply to avoid a bicyclist who had suddenly appeared in the road. The car hit a stone wall. Neither Gonzalo nor Beatrice appeared seriously injured at first. Both walked away from the crash. Beatrice was fine, But a few hours later, Gonzalo began experiencing symptoms, pain in his abdomen, the telltale signs of internal bleeding. Because of his hemophilia, the impact that had seemed minor was causing him to bleed internally. He died 2 days later on August 13, 1934, from internal bleeding. He was 19 years old, never married, never having had the chance to live a normal adult life, dying from a car accident that wouldn't have killed anyone else. The pattern is horrifying in its repetition. Leopold died from a fall. Fritty died from a fall. Heinrich died from a fall. Alfonso died from a car accident. Gonzalo died from a car accident. Rupert Cambridge died from a car accident in 1928. Over and over, minor trauma that would cause bruises in normal people caused fatal bleeding in hemophiliacs. The disease made them vulnerable to everyday accidents that the rest of us survive without thinking. The Spanish royal family never recovered its stability during the Republican period. The hemophilia that plagued Alfonso and Gonzalo contributed to the monarchy's weakness, to public perception that the royal line was cursed or tainted, to the succession crises that had culminated in exile. When the monarchy was eventually restored decades later in 1975, it was through Juan, the one healthy son, whose son Juan Carlos became king. Juan Carlos's son is the current king of Spain, Felipe VI. The hemophiliac line died out, unable to produce heirs, destroyed by the disease Victoria had unknowingly passed to her great-grandsons. So let's talk about the science, because understanding what hemophilia actually is helps explain why it was so devastating. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder that affects blood clotting. When you cut yourself, your body initiates a complex cascade of chemical reactions designed to form a clot and stop the bleeding. This cascade requires multiple proteins called clotting factors, numbered factor I through factor 13. These factors activate in sequence, each one triggering the next, culminating in the formation of fibrin threads that weave together to create a stable clot. It's an elegant system, but it only works if all the factors are present and functional. People with hemophilia are missing one of these crucial factors. There are two main types of hemophilia. Hemophilia A, the most common, forming about 80% of cases, is caused by a deficiency of clotting factor 8. Hemophilia B, which is rarer, is caused by a deficiency of clotting factor 9. Both types have similar symptoms and inheritance patterns, but they're caused by mutations in different genes. In 2009, using DNA extracted from the bones of Tsarevich Alexei and his family members recovered from the execution site, scientists finally determined that the royal disease was hemophilia B. The specific mutation was identified in the F9 gene on the X chromosome. The mutation created what's called a splice acceptor site error in exon 4 of the gene. This technical-sounding defect essentially meant that when cells tried to produce factor 9 protein, the instructions were garbled, resulting in a truncated, non-functional version of the protein. Without functional factor 9, the clotting cascade couldn't complete, leaving Victoria's descendants unable to form stable blood clots. The gene is located on the X chromosome, which is why the disease follows such a distinctive inheritance pattern. Women have two X chromosomes, XX, so if one carries the mutation, the other chromosome's healthy copy can usually compensate. They're carriers but typically don't have symptoms, though some carriers do experience mild bleeding tendencies due to random X inactivation in some cells. Men have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome, XY, so if their single X chromosome carries the mutation, they have the disease in full expression. A woman who is a carrier has a 50% chance of passing the mutated X chromosome to each child. If she has a son and he inherits the mutated X, he will have hemophilia. If she has a daughter and the daughter inherits the mutated X, that daughter will be a carrier. A man with hemophilia cannot pass it to his sons because sons inherit the Y chromosome from their father, not the X. But every daughter of a hemophiliac will be a carrier because she must inherit his X chromosome, and his only X chromosome carries the mutation. This is why Prince Leopold's daughter Alice was guaranteed to be a carrier, while his son Charles Edward was guaranteed to be unaffected. This is why Tsarevich Alexei's sisters might have been carriers, but his condition couldn't pass through any sons he might have had if he'd lived to reproduce. This is why the disease spread through Victoria's daughters, but not through her healthy sons. For people with hemophilia, the symptoms can range from mild to severe depending on how much clotting factor they produce. Mild cases might produce 5 to 40% of normal factor levels and might have problems with bleeding after surgery or major trauma. Moderate cases produce 1 to 5% of normal factor levels and have bleeding episodes with minor injuries. Severe cases, which produce less than 1% of normal factor 8 or factor 9 levels, have frequent spontaneous bleeding episodes even without injury. This was likely the case for most of Victoria's descendants who had the disease, severe hemophilia B with almost no factor 9 production. Without adequate clotting factors, even minor injuries can cause prolonged bleeding. External cuts aren't usually the biggest problem because they can be compressed, bandaged, and kept clean. The real danger is internal bleeding. Hemophiliacs experience bleeding into muscles, bleeding into soft tissues, and especially bleeding into joints. This is called hemarthrosis, and it's excruciatingly painful. When blood seeps into a joint like the knee, ankle, or elbow, it causes immediate inflammation and swelling. The joint fills with blood that has nowhere to go. The pressure builds, stretching the joint capsule, irritating nerve endings, causing intense pain. The joint becomes stiff and immobile. The person literally cannot bend the affected joint without extreme pain. Over time, repeated bleeding into the same joint destroys the cartilage and bone, causing permanent damage, chronic arthritis, and disability. This is why Alexei was often unable to walk. This is why Leopold used a walking stick from a young age. The cumulative damage from repeated bleeding episodes was progressively crippling. The blood itself is toxic to joint tissue. Iron from broken down red blood cells damages the synovial membrane lining the joint. Inflammatory chemicals are released. The joint tries to heal, but the healing process itself can cause scarring and stiffness. Each bleeding episode damages the joint further, making it more susceptible to future bleeds, creating a vicious cycle of damage and re-injury. The most dangerous bleeds are intracranial hemorrhages, bleeding in or around the brain. Even a minor blow to the head can cause blood vessels in the brain to leak. Blood pools inside the rigid skull, building pressure, crushing delicate brain tissue. The symptoms can develop rapidly: severe headache, confusion, seizures, loss of consciousness. Without immediate treatment to relieve the pressure, intracranial bleeding is often fatal. This is what killed Leopold after his fall down the stairs in Cannes. This is what killed Friddy after he fell from the window. This is what killed Heinrich after he fell from a chair. A bump that would give a normal person a mild headache could be fatal to a hemophiliac. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was no treatment. None. Zero. Medical science simply hadn't progressed far enough to understand the biochemistry of blood clotting or to replace missing factors. Doctors could apply ice to reduce swelling, they could immobilize the affected limb with splints to prevent further damage, they could administer pain relief, though options were limited to opium derivatives and later aspirin, which ironically made bleeding worse. They could perform surgery to drain blood from joints, though this risked infection and was often more harmful than helpful. But they couldn't stop the bleeding at its source. They couldn't replace the missing clotting factor. They could only wait and hope the bleeding stopped on its own before causing permanent damage or death. This is why hemophilia was so terrifying for these royal families. Despite their wealth, despite having access to the best doctors in Europe, despite living in palaces with every comfort imaginable, they were completely helpless when bleeding episodes occurred. Their sons screamed in pain for days or weeks, and there was nothing anyone could do except wait. All the money and power in the world couldn't cure a genetic defect in the blood. Treatment for hemophilia wouldn't become available until the mid-20th century. In the 1960s, scientists developed methods to concentrate clotting factors from donated blood, allowing hemophiliacs to receive infusions of the missing protein. In the 1970s and 1980s, factor concentrate became more refined and safer. In the 90s, recombinant DNA technology made it possible to produce synthetic clotting factors without using donated blood, eliminating the risk of viral transmission. Today, hemophilia is manageable with regular factor replacement therapy. People with the condition can live relatively normal lives, though they still need regular medical care. But for Victoria's descendants, born decades or even a century too early, the disease was essentially a death sentence. They lived with chronic pain, disability, and the constant knowledge that any minor accident could kill them. And their families lived with the constant fear of losing them, the helplessness of watching them suffer, and the guilt of having passed on the disease. Now, let's address the big question. Did hemophilia really nearly end Victoria's bloodline? In a literal sense, no. Victoria has thousands of living descendants today through her children who didn't carry hemophilia, or who were carriers but whose descendants eventually lost the mutation. Edward VII's line, the current British royal family, is thriving. Victoria, the Princess Royal, had descendants through multiple children who survived and reproduced. Alfred, Helena, Arthur, Louis all had children who lived and spread Victoria's bloodline. But in specific branches, hemophilia absolutely did end the line. Leopold's male line died out. His son Charles Edward had no surviving children who reproduced successfully. His daughter Alice had only one surviving child, May Abel-Smith, whose descendants are all through the female line with no known hemophiliacs appearing. The Russian imperial family was completely wiped out when they were murdered in 1918, and Alexei's hemophilia meant he couldn't have had children even if he'd survived to adulthood. The Spanish hemophiliac line ended with Alfonso and Gonzalo, neither of whom had children. Multiple branches that would have continued through these boys ended abruptly because of hemophilia or violence, with hemophilia being a contributing factor. So hemophilia didn't end Victoria's entire bloodline, but it definitely ended or nearly ended specific branches of it. It killed 9 of her descendants directly. It prevented others from having children. It caused immeasurable suffering. It contributed to political instability and the fall of monarchies. In that sense, hemophilia nearly ended and in some cases did end significant portions of Victoria's royal legacy. If you found this story of how a genetic mutation changed European history fascinating, there are other royal bloodlines with equally dramatic medical legacies. Subscribe to explore how diseases and genetic conditions shaped dynasties, from the madness of King George to the inbreeding of the Habsburgs. Each family reveals something different about the intersection of power, genetics, and the limits of human control over our own biology. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.